One aspect of NURBS modeling that you're going to run into sooner or later is the trimmed surface. Now, what is a trimmed surface? It is a NURBS surface in which part of the surface has been hidden both in the viewport and at render time. It's a way that you can kind of not exactly break and not exactly bend, but kind of work around the rules of NURBS in order to make surfaces that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And here's a quick example of how you can create one. We go to Create, NURBS Primitives, and create a circle. We'll scale everything up. Let me hide the grid away so it's no longer in the way. And we'll go to Surfaces and do a planar. Now, this is a NURBS surface, but it's perfectly circular. It only has one edge around the outside. That means it's breaking one of the primary rules of NURBS surfaces. How is it doing that? Well, it's only doing that because it is a trimmed surface. Notice it has all of the NURBS components, but it also has trim edges, which I can select out here. So what is this? This is a curve on surface that is used as a boundary. Inside this boundary, we see an object. Outside this boundary, we see nothing. And I can prove it to you. If I select this object, let's kind of pull it up a little bit away from the circle. I can go to Edit NURBS, Untrimmed Surfaces, and here's what the object looks like all by itself. It is just a NURBS plane with a circular curve-on surface upon it, and that curve-on surface, that circle, is used to hide out the outer corners of the surface. That's all there is. Now, why am I making a big deal out of this? Well, I mean, I'm sure at least one or two of you know what what trim surfaces are. If you don't, you know now. The reason is that sometimes you're probably going to have to rely on them in certain situations, and there are some things to be considered when you have to do that. For example, if I make, this is a very simple example, and as you work with NURBS, you'll see more examples, but I'll start off by creating a circle, and I'll scale it up a bit. Let's duplicate it. I'll move it up, scale it out some more, maybe not quite that much. We'll duplicate it again, scale in, and let's go ahead and do a loft in between all these circles. Now, what I'd like to do is to completely flatten out the top of the surface. Let me grab my loft, and we'll increase the section spans up to 2. Let me grab holes, and we have this innermost hole here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to snap that in the Y direction so it lines up with this hull. Let's grab the next hull down the surface, and I'll snap that up as well. So now what I've done is I've completely flattened off the top of this surface. Now let me get rid of all my curves. Okay. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, that I would like to cap off the top of this so that so it's no longer got a hole. It's more of like a tabletop here on top. I can do that with a trimmed surface. I can select isoparms. I can grab this isoparm. Remember, it's just like a curve. And I could, for example, just go ahead and do a planar surface, like so. And there are a lot of ways to create trimmed surfaces. We'll be discussing those later on when we start talking about the trim tool. And things look pretty good. If you get really close, you'll notice there's a little bit of gappage. And if you do a render, ooh, you can see that gappage is a bit more pronounced. It's kind of right up here in your face. Now, this is kind of a problem and not really a problem. In this particular case, it's not really much of a problem at all. You just have to remember that a NURBS surface is tessellated at render time. And if we want to make this look cleaner, all we need to do is go in and adjust that tessellation. For example, I can grab the trim surface, and let's just go ahead and we'll do U divisions factor, V divisions factor. We'll crank those up. Let's go ahead and go down to common tessellation options. Now, all of these are discussed in the workflow video that involves NURBS tessellation, which hopefully you've watched by now. Let's go ahead and switch on smooth edge, so it'll smooth that edge out. And then we'll come up here to our kind of the body of this can that we're building. And we could increase tessellation here as well. You can also smooth the edges out here. Now, the catch is that as long as you have differentiation in tessellation, meaning that you're not lining up polygon point to polygon point, then you will have gaps. The idea is to sit here and tweak your tessellation until those gaps all but disappear. And in this case, they're pretty much gone. Now, that's one way to approach this problem. Another way, if I were to undo all the way back, it's right here. Notice I've backed up to where we have gaps again. This is kind of a trick, and you can use this if you want. We'll probably be using it a little bit later, is we can take our trimmed surface, push it down just a little bit, an almost imperceptible amount. In fact, even less than what I just did. Let me go ahead and we'll go to our translate options. We'll take translate y, and let's set that to negative 0.001. It just barely even moved. Now, we can scale this up a little bit. And when we render, no gaps at all. And why is that? Because all we did is we eliminated the gaps. The two surfaces are technically overlapping one another, except you can't really tell because the change in difference is just so minute. It's just another way to take a look at fixing problems with trim surfaces if you run into any gaps similar to this. Watch out for using trim surfaces, again, because sometimes tessellating them in such a way that everything will line up can be a bit troublesome. Don't use them if you don't have to. For example, here I don't really need a trim surface if I don't want to use one. I could grab this isoparm. Let's go to Edit Curves. We'll duplicate surface curves. Let's center the pivot of that curve, and we'll scale it down. Now let's do a loft from this isoparm to this curve. So surfaces, loft, boom. You see that come right in? Now we can grab this circle and just scale it in, and scale it in, and scale it in. And now when I deselect, boom, there you go. We could even, in this case, we could now go so far as to attach these together, like so, and now it's one contiguous surface. And there are no gaps here because you don't need any. So think about trim surfaces. Think about whether or not you absolutely have to have them. In circular environments such as this, I usually don't use them. If you have an irregular opening that you need to close in, yeah, you might need to rely on a trim of some kind. But play with them, practice, adjusting that tessellation, running into some of the problems, and then take a look at ways that you can maybe overlap the surface to make the gaps disappear, or maybe you can make the gaps so small that at a normal viewing distance they're no longer a problem. For example, if this weren't a soda can, if it were maybe a bullet casing coming out of a very large gun, then a little gap wouldn't be any problem at all. We'd never see it at render time anyway. So keep things like that in mind, and don't let yourself get too bogged down if it's actually not going to be a problem in your final render. That's going to wrap things up for this discussion. Thanks a lot.